Hello everyone and welcome to the latest edition of the First Thursday Club from RSK Biocensus. My name is John Davis. I'm a director at RSK Biocensus and I also head up our biodiversity net gain team, RSK Wilding. And today we have a very interesting talk. They're all very interesting as it turns out, but this one is very close to my heart because we're doing quite a lot of work on these with RSK Wilding. And we're going to be talking about local nature recovery strategies. I won't steal Simon's thunder by talking about them now, but it's more to do with how you engage with the public in these strategies. Anyway, before I introduce Simon, if you go onto the first slide or the second slide, I'll do the normal housekeeping. So all of you are muted as per usual, but we obviously don't want to mute you permanently. So if you do have questions, please pop them into the questions box. I will sift through those during the talk and pick out the really nasty ones for Simon at the end. If we don't get through all of the questions, then Simon's very happily agreed to answer those by email afterwards. So don't panic if we haven't answered your question. There will be a feedback form coming to you in about an hour's time after the talk. So do please fill that in and come up with alternative talks for the future. That'd be great. Do bear in mind we have a whole back catalogue of First Thursday Club webinars. If you just Google RSK Biocensus First Thursday Club, you'll probably see them all there. All very interesting, very well worth listening to. Okay, right. Let me introduce you, Simon. So Si is Environment Engagement Lead for Nature Positive. So that's the sister company of RSK Wilding and RSK Biocensus. And before that, he headed up the education department at Bristol Zoo for several decades. I'm sure he won't mind me saying that. In fact, he and I go back a very long way. We went on our first expedition to Venezuela in 1989, which shows A, how long we've known each other, and B, how ancient we are. But in recent months, Simon's very much been focusing on local nature recovery strategies, and specifically the engagement side of that, and that makes him obviously perfect to give this presentation. So I will stop wittering and hand over to Simon. If you'd like to turn off your camera, but not your microphone, and over to you.
Here we go. Thanks, John, for that introduction. Yes, so I'm going to talk quite a bit about the local nature recovery strategies. I'm going to start off just with a little bit of an overview of what they are, and then our engagement work, what we aim to achieve by it, some of the techniques that we use as well, and then just draw out some of the interesting insights that we found out. And then some Q&A at the end when we've got some time for that. So first of all, just a bit about the local nature recovery strategies themselves. These are mandatory to be produced in England, introduced by the Environment Act 2021, and 48 responsible authorities across England were charged with working with stakeholders across the public, private and voluntary sectors. So this is the guidance from DEFRA was very much to essentially talk to everybody, to basically describe the area for each of their responsible authority areas, its pressures and opportunities, map the existing sites, and then look at priorities for nature's recovery in their area, and establish some proposals for actions, and then map those proposals. So pretty straightforward, really. This whole process was overseen by Natural England, with advice from the Environment Agency and the Forestry Commission as well, and government provided £14 million for the preparation of these strategies. And the initial suggestion was that by March 2025, that all of these would be produced and in place and published across the whole of England. We'll come back to that in a moment and see how we're getting on. So essentially, it's pretty straightforward. I've just coloured all of these in just to stop it being a black and white map. This is more interesting, but also it suggests, it implies that all of these responsible authorities were doing this independently. That's not quite true, actually. There was lots of coordination and each responsible authority discussing with surrounding and connecting areas as well. But in essence, a lot of actually exactly how it was done was left up to the individual responsible authorities to decide exactly how they were going to do it. So you have got actually this patchwork of responsible authorities producing a patchwork of local nature recovery strategies across the whole of England. But essentially what we end up with, or should end up with, for each local nature recovery strategy is a statement of biodiversity priorities containing those things listed there, and the local habitat map with existing areas for nature marked on it, and also areas that are or could become, most important, could become of particular importance for biodiversity. And then after that, what does that lead to? So these have some statutory weight, these local nature recovery strategies. So it's essentially there's a new duty on all public authorities to have regard to. So it's not they don't have to do everything, but basically planning authorities have to have regard to the local nature recovery strategies. And there is already an incentive, or there will be. The initial idea actually was to have these in place before biodiversity net gain happened, but it's happened in the other order. But built into this, there should be an incentive for biodiversity net gain for the correct sorts of bits of nature recovery to happen in where the LNRS suggested, and therefore an uplift in the biodiversity net gain calculations to encourage the things to be done in these particular areas. Integrating the LNRSs into the planning system, there may well be funding for specific activities, although that's as yet unspecified. And part of that is it will become from private finance. So the government has set a goal to raise 500 million initially per year of private finance, and then coming up to $1 billion a year. Not sure exactly how that's going to happen, but that's an aspiration. And this is all contributing, putting all these pieces, these jigsaw pieces together to contribute to the nature recovery network across the whole of England, which is a commitment in that 25-year environment plan. So that's essentially the background to local nature recovery strategies, what they're based on, what they consist of. And so coming back to how many are published so far of those 48, well, there are 4 of them. West of England Combined Authority really bombed ahead and produced theirs actually last year, 2024. North and Northamptonshire have published theirs as well, as have Cornwall, the Isles of Scilly and the Isle of Wight. And as you can see just within screen grabs, they're all actually produced quite differently. Some are highly designed, some are less highly designed. And again, this is a reflection of the fact that all of those responsible authorities could produce these essentially in the way that they want. There was plenty of guidance from DEFRA, but also quite a lot of leeway in the way that these were produced. And part of the consultation and engagement work was also to gauge how people would like these to be produced so that they're usable for the people that need to use them and want to use them. One of the consistent things though, and things are looking fairly similar, however the others are designed, is those habitat maps, all using a similar platform and basically having lots of overlaid layers, which if anyone works with GIS, these are fairly straightforward to use, but anyone who hasn't used maps like this before, there's a little bit of a learning curve to be able to turn layers on and off and see what's existing nature areas, etc. So coming on to how we started with the engagement work then. So this is a slightly odd title, mandatory but not mandatory. It's mandatory to create these local nature recovery strategies by these 48 responsible authorities, but delivery is entirely voluntary. So once the LNRS is in place, it doesn't force anyone to do anything with their land, but also it doesn't stop anyone doing anything with their land. So if something's going to be basically run out voluntarily, it's really important to find out the mechanisms and who's with and who's against, if you like. So essentially we were contracted to do the engagement work with 3 responsible authorities, so that's Hull and East Yorkshire, South Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire and Nottingham. But we've also been watching what's going on in other areas and participating in our own areas as well. And so this is very much about helping the creation of the local nature recovery strategies. But we always had in our mind as well, thinking beyond that, even though this wasn't, this is not mandatory to do at this stage, but to my mind, there's no point in producing a strategy if you haven't actually gathered the information that you need to inform how it's going to be delivered as well. And so, as you can see, as we go through how we did the engagement, that colours quite a lot of how we did the engagement, because we're finding out not just what needs doing and where it needs doing, but actually how it might get rolled out in reality. So essentially this was led by Nature Positive, but working with actually 4 other RSK companies, so RSK Wilding, but also ADAS and Copper, and of course RSK Biosensors as well. So much a teamwork. So an example here of how Nottinghamshire did their mapping of existing areas. So this is a little bit of an acronym quiz. I'm such a pedant. These actually mostly aren't acronyms because acronyms are supposed to be pronounceable, but there we go. So we've got triple SIs here, Sites of Special Scientific Interest. Play along at home. You can decide what you think the next one is and then see if you're right. National nature reserves are marked on here, local nature reserves, special areas of conservation, local wildlife sites, plotting the trees in the ancient tree inventory, key biodiversity areas, irreplaceable habitat, which include these areas here. And of course, this is not an exclusive list, an entire list, a comprehensive list, because there may be other things that are locally relevant as well. So it could be Ramsar sites in some responsible areas, for example. So essentially, that's a basic map of what already exists and what's important for nature and what sort of designation that it has. And some are statutory designations and some are local designations. But what you can also see from maps like this is how fragmented quite a lot of these nature areas are. And of course, going by the Lawton principles, one of the important things to do when thinking about nature recovery is about joining up some areas. And so that may inform actually the mapping of priorities for nature recovery into the future. So in our engagement work, what we wanted to find out was absolutely the engagement of the experts to find out for each area, what are the important habitats for those particular counties and important species, and therefore what would be the most appropriate nature recovery area, things to happen and where they should happen. But it's also important when we're thinking rollout to think about existing constraints and opportunities. And quite a lot of those will actually come from talking to other people as well. So it's really important in this work to think about what everyone else wants to see as well, beyond the usual suspects. And so actually thinking about the wider public as well. And again, there was lots of encouragement from DEFRA to include very, very many parts. I mean, basically everybody. If you read through the non-strategy guidance for engagement, it basically says, do you know what, go and talk to everybody. People who live in inner city areas, people with access to nature, people without access to nature, people with disabilities, ethnic minorities, essentially very wide consultation, including very much about beyond the usual suspects that might get involved in thinking about nature conservation. So we wanted to know what people understand about nature, what part they think they might play in its recovery, what the real and perceived barriers might be in the enablers. And I put this picture in there just because it highlights something which I'll also bring up as I go through the rest of this. A species expert or an ecologist might look at that and know exactly what it is, whereas anyone else you walked out on the street would just go, well, it's a seagull, isn't it? Of course, it's actually a black-hooded kittiwake, but it's important when talking to the wider public, I hate that term, but let's use it for the moment, when talking to the general public, that we don't assume knowledge, but they may have lots of intrinsic knowledge, which is still very important. So what I'm going to show you is basically some of the techniques that we used, a little bit of insight into what we did and why we did it, and some of the broad overviews of findings. Now, obviously, the detailed findings are relevant to each particular area have gone to each of these responsible authorities that we worked with. But what I've done is sort of amalgamated and simplified some of the overall messages because there were some consistent themes that were coming out across the whole engagement work, which I thought would be really interesting to share. Because, yeah, what people know, what people understand, and what they want to see, we were finding very similar results from absolutely everywhere. So in broad brushstrokes, these are the kinds of people that we're running workshops with. So obviously the ecologists and environmental NGOs and people who've been working in nature conservation in these areas for a long time. There's lots and lots of existing knowledge to draw out and bring into these local nature recovery strategies, but also with planners and community groups and getting together people who maybe own large tracts of land who aren't necessarily farmers or organisations that are working at landscape scale. And many of those were done in traditional kind of workshop style situations, getting people in a room or online, either around pieces of paper with coloured pens or using some of the techniques I'm going to explain in just a moment. Now, farmers, of course, are really important because quite a lot of the nature recovery may well need to happen and probably is already happening on land that they're farming and managing as well. We wanted to approach that differently. And so quite a lot of this was actually going out to where they already were, going to ploughing matches, but also holding meetings in places like in NFU offices, going to county shows, or even just having an evening in the pub and having a conversation. Is a really important way of engaging in an attractive way, particularly if there's free food which we provided. And then you've got the public. Again, I'll unpack this in a moment to explain a little bit more, but we did this in a variety of places. We went to a zoo for a day, RSPB reserves and country parks, but of course in those places you're going to get people who are already thinking perhaps a little bit about wildlife and conservation. We also went out to county shows and city festivals, but also into shopping centres, because we wanted to absolutely put ourselves where just people are doing their normal everyday lives, and then we pop up and ask them about the future of nature recovery. So it's not expecting people to come to us, but us going to them. And there were also a number of online surveys with questions, carefully created questions, but also the opportunity to put pins on a map, because a lot of the LNRS is all about spatial mapping and thinking what needs to be done and where it needs to be done. And so gathering information from people about their local favourite areas, or things they think are being looked after, or things where initial projects are going on, and people being able to put a pin on a map and then annotate that and tell us something about them is really important as well. What's really important to state here, though, is that when you do something like that, it's a self-selecting group of people that can be bothered to sit down and go through and do an online survey, or even know that it exists, however much publicity you do. I'll come back to that as well. So just unpacking a couple of the workshop tools that we used. One of my favourite ones actually is Mentimeter. Now this is a way of, this can be done online, it can be done in workshop situations in a room as well, and it works quite well in that situation. And it essentially involves setting up a presentation, and you can have sorting questions, you can do word clouds, you can give people a variety of things to choose from. But the beauty of it is it's entirely anonymous. You don't have to sign up to anything. It runs on people's laptops or phones or tablets. You can put up a QR code so people can go to the site immediately. And you basically run through a series of questions. But what's really nice about it is it's anonymous, and then the answers come straight up there and then. So you can share these on a big screen, and it generates that discussion then in the room, which can be really enlightening. And because it's anonymous, it allows people to say things which they may not say out loud. So some of the things we were wanting to get opinions on and thoughts on was things like this. So actually asking things like, who might not prioritise nature recovery? Because again, when you think about rollout, you need to know what people's, and this is important, this is about perceptions, not necessarily reality, but who people think will be with them and who they think the barriers might be in terms of what kinds of people, which stakeholder groups. So I know that I've deliberately put these up very small, so you won't be able to see most of the writing on these. And remember, these are from across the board, so they're not attributed to any particular responsible authority area. But I just want you to see the consistency here. And after a while of doing these in workshop after workshop, because what you can do up on the screen is have these come up but blanked out, but you can see the size of responses that are coming back from these word clouds. And always, almost always, developers were the ones that came up in the middle as the members of society, if you like, that people in the workshops we were running thought that wouldn't be prioritising nature recovery. So you've got developers in there, occasionally politicians as well, and farmers were kind of coming in fairly well, but it was basically developers. But then important to follow that up and ask why. So when we asked why people had mentioned those people, some of it is very obvious. Of course, it's about conflicting land use. You know, if you're a developer, your job is to produce whatever development you're going to produce, whether it's a housing development or whatever. But interestingly, quite a lot of people started talking about profit motives or lack of awareness, or even things like this. So when people were sharing, because this is anonymous, they would quite frequently say things that they probably wouldn't have said out loud. And so selfishness, greed, and uncaring disregard for nature actually was coming out strongly time after time after time. And interestingly, this was the same in the online surveys. Going back to this point that the online surveys were a self-selecting group of people already pretty well connected with nature as well, I would suggest. And so there was this real sense that they were viewing other parts of society as just almost not very nice, which I don't think people would have said out loud in these situations. Now, I'm sure there are fantastic developers whose favourite hobby is to go out bird watching or whatever, and they do fantastic stuff in the gardens. I don't know, but I found this really interesting about these kinds of phrases and words that people were using. When we asked farmers, they also said the same thing, but they also brought up things like they were specific about intensive farmers, may not prioritise nature recovery, but also were very much about thinking people coming and walking in the countryside and on their farmland, and dog walkers, not paying attention to the disturbing farmland birds and things like that. So we ask questions like this as well, because if you just get people in a room thinking about nature and being positive about nature, you get a very, perhaps even blinkered view. So asking things like this, and that just forces people to think a little bit outside the box. So asking a question like, when does nature get in the way, or is even a nuisance? And of course, you've got things like development, but also things like people coming up with, when I'm driving up to junctions and I can't see because the grass has grown too long because the council hasn't mown it or whatever. So there's some really personal issues that people have, or disrupting disabled access to certain areas because of uneven surfaces, or paths getting overgrown or something like that, or people saying that their playing field is just getting overgrown. So it's quite important sometimes to ask questions which just open people's minds up to thinking slightly outside the box. And just coming back to this online survey again, this was really interesting. So more than 10% of survey respondents basically said nature should never get in the way. It should always take priority, and basically everything, humans just have to learn to live with it and do everything they want around it, but nature should always take priority. And in fact, our survey responses were showing that our survey respondents were almost entirely white, middle class or retired, and with a variety of other questions as well, were very well connected with nature, many of them volunteering with nature conservation organisations. So just labouring this point that all of these are not representative of the wider population. So again, thinking about rollout, we talked about barriers, and these are slightly fuzzy as they come up just because these are screen grabs taken from the Mentimeter results. Finance is coming up right at the top, and that's maybe for financial incentives, but also financing conservation programs and organisations as well, competing for demand for land, of course, but lack of priority from central and local government. But this kept coming up again as well. Public opinion was a barrier. Lots of people in workshops were saying that they thought the public were uneducated. People in the online survey as well, they were saying, people are not connected enough with nature. The general public is uneducated, doesn't know and doesn't care enough. And some of these other things I put in as well, just to give a smattering of examples. And again, perhaps these are some of the things which people wouldn't say out loud, but they don't mind putting in an anonymous workshop situation. And in fact, there were 5 responses when we asked about enablers as well. What would most enable nature recovery? There were 5 responses where people actually wrote, "Get rid of people." So you can get all sorts of interesting responses when you make things anonymous like this. We use some anonymous techniques like this as well when you've got people in a room and maybe you're having a conversation. This is particularly useful with farmers, actually. You can get some quite loud conversations going on, and a room can sometimes be dominated by a particular view which may not be held by everybody. And so this is useful in all sorts of situations, but this is just some, and again, this is not absolute results, but it's informed by the kinds of results we were getting. So you can essentially put a big piece of paper out with some sentences on it like this, and then just leave some stickers lying around and get people to stick on the sticker along this line as to how much they agree or disagree with a statement like this. And so with this top one, there's a school of thought for some people that actually completely separating food production and making it very intensive and leaving other areas for nature is one way of going about it. Another way is just kind of integrating. And it's interesting here that actually most farming engagement that we did was very much about disagreeing with this. They thought that actually bringing it and integrating nature recovery onto their farms is really important. So then there's implications of productivity. So we asked specifically, does encouraging nature onto farmland reduce productivity? And there's a broad spread here, which is potentially because of different farmers with different experiences or different sizes of farms or different things that they're farming. But there's sort of quite a lot sitting in the middle here, but also quite a lot disagreeing. Now, the point I want to make about the third one down here is that it's essentially the opposite of the top one. And this is quite a useful technique of just making sure that people are reading things correctly. So the top one is about separating land for food production, and then this next one is about integrating nature and farming across the landscape. So hopefully what you want to see is this, and this is what we did see, is the dots the other way around, and that gives you confidence that people are reading this and answering it properly. So it's just a kind of way of checking. And about seeing this as an opportunity, there are certainly farmers who don't see this as an opportunity, but there's quite a good spread. Some are sitting right in the middle because a lot of the implications yet are not completely transparent and completely obvious. But so there's some equivocation on this, but it's definitely a spread across those who definitely don't see this as an opportunity, but some who absolutely do. Just coming back to a couple of the other examples from Mentimeter, and I want to come back to this point about engagement and education. So often this phrase about come up in workshops, and it certainly came up in the online surveys, that the general public is not educated enough. They don't understand about nature and nature recovery and how important it is. So for the last bit, what I want to go through is, so let's find out how much education do the others really need. And if you organise a workshop and invite the general public along, you're just going to get the room again full of the usual suspects. And as I've already laboured the point that if you do surveys, again, it's a self-selecting group of people, hence why we went out to agricultural shows, city shows, shopping centres. One on the right is an out-of-town shopping centre not far away from Sheffield on a wet Sunday afternoon. And this is absolutely going out where people are. And I just wanted to unpack a little bit about what we did here and some of the interesting results that came out. So this is remembering that people aren't ecologists. So there's no point in going out with a clipboard and saying, you know, here's a list of habitats, which ones you think are important. So we basically devised some games. If you stand there and look officious and with a clipboard, you're not going to engage very, very many people. And also people think you're just trying to sell them stuff. And sometimes you want to think about branding as well. So here we've got still set up with the nature positive tablecloths on. Sometimes, and particularly with farmer engagement, we used non-branded tablecloths because nature positive could be said to be actually kind of leading an audience as well. Anyway, I think probably most people didn't even notice what was on the tablecloth, but it's important sometimes to think about branding and make yourself as neutral as possible. Again, if you look too slick, sometimes just people think you're trying to sell them something. So it's worth looking just a little bit not too slick so that people want to come and see what's going on. And positioning yourselves right where people are. If you expect people to walk into an area, into a marquee, into a tent, it's less likely that they will engage. But if you're right in the middle of the thoroughfare of a shopping centre and look a bit intriguing, that's when people will join in. And making it to a bit of a game. So actually we usually basically said, you know, we've got a pile of sweets in the middle there as well, you know, come along, play our game here, have a look at these pictures and see what you think you like. And the important thing here is this is starting a conversation. So I'll show you the pictures in a moment and how we read this, but basically we were giving people some counters and saying, here's some images. I'll give you 4 counters, just pop them on the images that you like. And then we would ask them why they'd chosen those. And that's where the interesting stuff happens. So you don't lead them, you don't say which are right or wrong, and there are no right or wrong, as I'll show you in a moment. This is just a question of people choosing what they think the future might look like. And then basically having a conversation and noting down. We didn't take verbatim conversations unless it was a really interesting quote, but general themes that people talked about as to why they'd chosen the images they'd chosen. And then we wanted to find out about demographics. You do that last of all, that's where the clipboard comes in, and then you can do this anonymously. What I did here though is in advance, you actually put some down. So because obviously the first person you hand it out to, it's not anonymous if there's nothing there already. So you can fill in a little bit, photograph it at the beginning of the day, and then subtract that from the end of the day. And it also gives an indication of how you want people to fill it in. So I know these are very small on the screen here, but I'm going to show you some slightly bigger ones in a moment. So these are for urban or peri-urban green spaces, and you can see they're, in general, they're all quite nice. They're nice, different, but just different urban green spaces. So there's nothing here that people would go, no, I definitely think that's horrible. So they're all nice, but nice in different ways. And we did similarly with the wider landscape, all nice, looking okay, looking green, but with different aspects to them. And again, it's a conversation starter. So what did we find out? And we did, just to also highlight, we did this particular exercise across all of the different modes as well. So we used this as the main engagement event when we were running, out in shopping centres, etc. But we also did this in the online surveys, and we also did it in workshops as well. And for the urban areas, these images I'm showing you on the screen now are the ones which basically are universal picking of them. People loved these ones. It didn't matter whether we asked them in workshops or on the online survey or out in a shopping centre. And these are showing quite biodiverse areas, certainly quite wildish areas for an urban landscape. But they've also got elements of being close to habitation and also close to water. People love the water. and accessibility. So you've got path top right, you've got sort of the mown edge, but the rest of it left to grow a little bit long. There's a lot of paths and benches, people picking out of these as well as the water. What was interesting is when we actually asked the general public, I hate that term, but there we go, they liked those top ones, but they also added these and picked these out. So G on the right there, for example, they loved that pond, and they actually liked it slightly more than L because they said they can get to it and look into it much more easily. So accessibility was really important, and thinking of also areas to play on. And a few people, particularly when we were in the inner city shopping centres, also picked out these. Now, not as the top ones, but they also picked them and said, actually, even something like that is really aspirational, to be able to just walk out of your front door and have a grassy, naturey space to play on. So just to reiterate, all of the ones at the top there were the ones that everybody agreed on, but the public were kind of adding these extra ones, showing this kind of interesting mix of thinking about different land uses. And then for the wider landscape, these again, in similar vein, these are the ones that pretty much everyone was agreeing on right the way across the board. So trees, water, the Bluebell Woods actually was one of the really, really popular ones, but also the Beaver Dam over there on the right, number 1, apart from farmers actually, but everyone else picked this one out and they thought that was a great idea. And they did know what it was because they asked, or if they weren't sure, we'd said what it was. We weren't pushing them towards it, but just indicating what it was. And again, plus, here are the ones where they were, with the general public consultation, they were also adding these. The one in the middle there, number 9 at the bottom, that's marked number 9, that was to do with accessibility. That's why people picked that out. They also added in number 4, which is about renewable energy generation. And quite a lot of people said, and these were general public conversations, in fact, 5 or 6 people said, you know, I quite like those. I rather like the windmills. But everybody else knew exactly what they were for, and said, and we need those as well. And so they were thinking about farming, they were thinking about accessibility, they were thinking about renewable energy generation. And remember, this was just us showing them images and then picking them out, us not leading them at all. And bottom left, that's actually the links there as well. We popped the links in to see if there was any call for that. And the general public actually really likes that idea. And so we had sometimes lengthy conversations with people. And so there was some general excitement about maybe reintroducing links, but maybe it's the sleep beamers first. And one slight anomaly there, this one was only picked out in the online survey and by farmers, the sunny farmers field there. But yeah, so interesting there. So really coming to the overall summary at the end now. So what I think this has shown us is that there is enthusiastic support for nature recovery, with some caveats, of course. And I would suggest that some of the things we were finding from the workshops and the online survey, with people saying the general public don't understand, they need educating. Now, someone out and doing their shopping on a Sunday afternoon may not be able to identify particular species or name particular habitats, but that's not important. They know about functioning connected nature and the importance of it. They know about it for its own benefit. They know about it for their own benefit as well, because they talked about how important it was, particularly in the urban spaces, for them to have access to that, particularly teenagers. When we were outside the lingerie department of M&S in Meadowhall Shopping Centre, we actually spoke mostly that day to older teenagers, who were the ones that stopped and engaged. Everyone else wanted to go out and do their shopping. And they were very much talking about their desire for safe, and here we go, well-planned, safe, accessible green spaces, good for nature and for people. And they love the water as well in the urban green spaces. This is just an image I took in the middle of Nottingham actually a couple of weeks ago, which kind of typifies the kinds of things that people were telling us that they would like. And I think this is a really well-designed space. At least I think so. That's my impression. And for the wider landscape, again, there is a common understanding, and what people want is this landscape scale planning, balancing the needs of nature and wildlife, food production, renewable energy generation, recreational access, and that came out really strongly from those wider public results, this balanced land use, indicated by that variety of pictures there. So my last slide. So essentially, I think what we've got here is a really good joined up and agreed vision of what the future should look like. Of course, there are a few differences here and there, but fundamentally, everyone's actually pretty clued up as to the kinds of future that they want. So what we need to do now, once these local nature recovery strategies are produced, is for people to communicate that shared vision, to show that people do understand, to just enable things to happen. So we need to get the legal, the practical, and the financial frameworks in place to enable this to happen. And I think the local nature recovery strategies are going to be one of those really useful organising frameworks that this can be based upon. So I hope that's shown you some of the techniques that we used and why we used them, and some of those kind of interesting results that came out, and the fact that, yeah, I think everyone, time and time again, I turned to the person that I was doing each of these engagement events with and said, look, there we go, proved again. People really do understand. They know what they want. They've got really good understanding, sensible conversations. Now we just need to make it happen.
Brilliant, great stuff. Thank you, Simon. If you want to pop your camera back on. You talked about not being too slick, but I think that was a very slick presentation, so thank you very much. You also talked about teenagers lurking outside lingerie departments of M&S, which I found bewildering, but there we are. Let's move on.
It just happened. It was close to the transport hub as well at Meadow Hall, so there was loads and loads of people coming past. It just happened to be. I just dropped that in, but it just, you know, it was, and it was interesting actually how that day, and some teenagers even said, "Oh, I haven't got time now. I'll come back," and then they did. They were amazing. A little group of lads. They came back and went, "Oh, we said we'd come back, and here we are."
We do have a question about younger people, which I'll come on to in a second. I just wanted to say, I think the accessibility point is really, really interesting. When you had that picture of two ponds, one which as an ecologist I'd look and go, yes, that's what you need it surrounded by vegetation, really species rich and interesting, and the one that people tended to like was one that they could actually get to. And we have to come together on this, because this idea of nature being away from people is not helpful. We need to engage as many people in this as possible if we're to get people buying into it. So I thought that was a very interesting point. Anyway, let me start you with an easy question, break you in gently. I hope it's easy. So this from James Tan. If they are mandatory, is there a deadline for when counties need to produce them? I'm assuming that's an easy question.
Well, initially they were supposed to be by March 2025, but there's always conversations to and fro between the responsible authorities and DEFRA, and it's been very clear that, particularly to do the engagement properly, this is much more complicated than was initially thought, and the mapping is very complex as well and takes the time. So at the moment there's quite a lot of leeway. I think the idea is to try and get them published this year, but I wouldn't be surprised if a few actually go into next year as well.
I mean, personally, I think it's better to get it right and not impose a deadline.
Absolutely.
Okay, right. How important is inclusive consultation? So you talked a lot about getting as many people involved as possible. Is this not something that experts should be doing without unhelpful inputs from ill-informed and perhaps worse, biased people?
I think that's really important, and this question has come up time and time again as we've been doing this. This whole approach. It's really important that the experts, the ecologists, the local nature recorders, etc., the people who've been working in wildlife conservation in these areas, that they're the ones that are mostly deciding what's important for particular counties. Your wider engagement is really important, because sometimes it gives that slightly wider view, thinking about and again, I'm thinking forwards to the delivery of this. If you just get a bunch of ecologists and species experts sitting in a room going, this is what we want, they could be a little bit blinkered because that's all they're thinking about. So widening that approach and finding out what other people think and what the challenges are, so that when it's then rolled out, you've got an understanding of the way things need to be rolled out, so that things looked after. So you haven't got just, you know, a verge that's grown and looks lovely, but actually the edge is mown, because then it's, you know, so it's in a way it's the delivery. What's really important though is that wider consultation, you're not relying on that to kind of get to the detail and the expert stuff, because that's not their area. So and then what you've got, and I think what's really, for me, was really important about this, is also feeding back that information that actually the general public, for want of a better phrase, actually are quite thoughtful and well informed and with this, and that's useful information to basically go, look guys, we're all heading for the same thing here, we just need to go on and do it. Broad support.
And it can be very you know, it's important not to be patronizing, and but you know, nevertheless, there will be people with strong biases. You talked about the fact that it's white middle class people that are, you know, so we do need a broad spectrum, but balancing all of those, I think, is always a difficult thing in consultation, and it's very qualitative, really. It can't really be quantitative.
Yeah.
Okay, this is from Sam Woods. Right, this is interesting. How do you see LNRS fitting with a future land use framework? So there's been a land use consultation recently, which I think you've probably seen. I increasingly think we need local land use frameworks. We're about to launch our LNRS next week, so he's in Leicestershire, but we are finding a lot of projects not making best use of stacked functions and or lack of trust from landowners, especially after the cancelling of the Sustainable Finance Initiative.
Yeah. It's interesting that I'll just pick up on the lack of trust thing as well, that there's, as soon as you put lines on a map, and of course this is about lines on a map with mapping the nature recovery areas as well, people immediately think, oh no, this is forcing me to do something, or isn't forcing me to do something. And there are portions of society that are particularly distrustful of DEFRA and distrustful of lines on a map because they're scared of what they're going to be used for in the future. So there's that. Yeah, I think this, in fact, in the land use framework document that went, the consultation's closed now, but in the previous document, it talked about the local nature recovery strategies actually, interestingly, being informed by it, because the LNRSs are going to be reviewed. Once they're published, they will be reviewed, everyone at once, between 3 and 10 years after the publication. And it suggests that they will be reviewed in light of the land use framework, which will be then, you know, will be published by then as well. They need to work together. And I think there's a real interesting balance as well between how local you go on things like this and how broad you go. Because of course there are trade-offs to be made. And the wider you go, almost the further back you can look and you can make those wider decisions. But at the end of the day, the delivery is absolutely local and affects people where they live, where they work, what they're doing. So I think that the challenge in the future is going to be that being able to zoom in and zoom out, look at a whole land use framework, but also local delivery, and get the balance right between what happens and the decisions that are taken at which level.
Yeah.
Glad I'm not in charge of that.
We've only got a couple of minutes. I want to get a few more questions in. So let's, first of all, Sam was a she, not a he, so apologies, Sam. We were talking about biases earlier. There's me showing my bias. Right, so this is from Des, our colleague Des. Do you think responses to your images might be skewed against the younger generation? Research has shown a tendency for children to prefer images of wilder looking habitat, but this wanes with age as adults start to lean towards the less wild. Do you have any data on the ages of respondents?
That's really interesting. And as we were going through this, actually, I was constantly, again, this idea came up that there's a PhD in this, there's several PhDs in this. We were trying to get a real overview here, but actually there's lots of things where you go, oh, do you know what? I mean, exactly like that. There's, you know, you could dig into and see actually how do the responses vary from different people. We haven't done that, and probably the way we've recorded the data, we wouldn't be able to do that because we were collecting overall data. Certainly from those public events. But yeah, I think there's all sorts of interesting stuff here which maybe should spark off several different PhDs.
Yeah. And this is from Joseph White. Was there a discernible difference in public opinion between rural and urban populations regarding the reintroduction of large predators and the installation of wind turbines?
Certainly the introduction of large predators, that was definitely out of town. And the turbines, you know, we didn't ask about that. But again, it comes back to this thing of people will think differently when they're looking at generalizations and then when they look at what's going to happen in their backyard, because that's what humans are like. But in a lot of cases, and I say there were those 5 cases where people said to us, actually, do you know what, I quite like wind turbines, I think they're beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that people in town would want large predators because they're not going to be bothered by them, and people out in the countryside would be more concerned. But I mean, lynx, I mean, Natural England, the boss of Natural England, Tony Juniper, was favourable of lynx in a Guardian article only yesterday or the day before.
Interesting.
Right, let's get through a couple more before we finish. Is there a potential conflict between wanting biodiverse areas with public access close to or in new developments and offsetting B&G offsite, which may be ecologically better?
Yeah, and I think quite a lot of biodiverse areas in urban areas are going to be biodiverse to a certain extent, but not necessarily, fully functioning ecosystems. If you want your proper, fully functioning native species ecosystem, then that's going to be out in a wider area where you can connect it up with loads of others. It just reminded me, one other conversation with a lad, older teenager in one of the shopping centres. He was looking at all the images and he went, "I really like that one, but it's an area where I think nature should be and I shouldn't be." And so there were a few conversations where people were thinking about actually having areas where access was restricted. So there was, again, we had some really interesting conversations with people, particularly in their shopping centres. I love those days, where people were really thinking through quite hard about designating areas for nature and areas where they could go and not disturb nature. They were really very thoughtful about it.
Yeah, I think on-site delivery for B&G is important, but you can't. People do tend to overstate how important it is for biodiversity. It's kind of more important for people accessing nature. It will deliver some biodiversity that is measurable in B&G terms, but if you really want to create, as you say, self-sustaining systems, they need to be larger and away from towns. But the two things can operate together.
But they can connect, yeah.
Yeah. Right, let's have one last one. Done that one. Right, thank you for the brilliant overview. This is from Kansu. My question is about the government's plan to raise private finance. You mentioned that for nature recovery. In your opinion, which sectors primarily will this come from? Do you think what kind of incentive there is for the private sector to invest, or what do you think that incentive is?
Oh, that's really interesting. It's not really my area, so I can't be very intelligent on it, about nature finance and how that can be leveraged. I mean, obviously it's happening now with biodiversity net gain, and what I'm not clear on is actually how much of that $500 million or $1 billion a year is expected to come from that direction. But there are all sorts of things now about green bonds being issued and all sorts of things. Not my area, so I better not kind of carry on.
No, but I guess there might be stuff related to carbon as well, where people are wanting to offset carbon and creating habitats as part of that. Also ESG, so environment, sustainability and governance, where corporations are required to demonstrate sustainable credentials. They might contribute to schemes as part of that. I guess that's it. I think Kansu is probably quite
a growing area,
optimistic of the government, but certainly people are wanting to invest in it. But normally investors want a return. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Okay, look, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, everyone. We've got 3 or 4 more questions, Simon, which I will ping over to you at the end if you're happy to answer those. Just to wrap up then, everyone. So first of all, thanks again, Ty, for a fantastic talk. We're going to have a hiatus next month for the school holidays. So we will be back on the 4th of September. And it will be Simon's colleagues in Nature Positive, Emily Lee and Ewan Chan, who are going to be giving a very interestingly titled talk, which is human rights, why human rights matter to construction and infrastructure and how ecologists can protect them. So I think the variety within First Thursday Club is pretty amazing. Everything from eel biology to human rights. So we cover a lot of subjects here. Finally, I mentioned at the top about the fact that we have all of our backlog online, so do please have a look at those. More than 50 very interesting talks, so do take a look at those and enjoy them, and we look forward to seeing you in September. Thanks again, Simon. Have a good day, everyone.